Among the most extraordinary cases to have reached the archives of Dr. Elizabeth Kübler-Ross, one of them began, not at a hospital bedside, but at a hotel table in Zurich in the autumn of 1974, as she prepared her lectures on death and dying during her travels through Central Europe. The brown envelope, stamped from Austria, bore the Salzburg postmark, dated September 23rd of that year. It contained a letter from Dr. Hans Leitner, a pediatrician at the Salzburg Regional Hospital, Salzburger Landeskrankenhaus, along with copies of medical records, handwritten notes from a music professor, and newspaper clippings from the Salzburger Nachrichten. The correspondence, which started with the typical formality of Austrian medicine at the time, quickly revealed an almost desperate urgency in the search for answers. Dr. Kübler-Ross held the documents under the yellowish light of the bedside lamp at the Bohr-au-Lac Hotel, where she was staying during her time in Zurich. Over the decades spent exploring the mysteries of human consciousness at the threshold of death, she had learned to identify cases that warranted special attention. This one presented all the characteristics of what she called borderline phenomena, experiences that escaped conventional medical categories and demanded an approach that blended scientific rigor with intellectual openness. Dr. Leitner's report was meticulous, beginning with the precise medical circumstances of the event that had changed young Karl Edlinger's life. On July 27, 1973, during an extraordinarily hot summer afternoon in Salzburg, 7-year-old Karl Edlinger drowned in Lake Fuschel, about 30 kilometers from the city. According to the hospital report attached to the letter, the child had been submerged for an estimated 8 to 12 minutes before being pulled from the water by a local fisherman. When the rescue team arrived, the boy was in a state of apparent clinical death, with no palpable pulse, no spontaneous breathing, fixed and dilated pupils, cyanotic lips, and an already dropping body temperature. Dr. Leitner described in his notes the application of resuscitation maneuvers, which included mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, manual cardiac massage, and subsequent orotracheal intubation upon arrival at the emergency room. The boy remained unconscious for 48 full hours. During this period, doctors monitored basic vital signs using a stethoscope for heart auscultation, a thermometer for body temperature, and rigorous clinical observation of pupillary responses to the light of a medical flashlight. Neurological evaluation relied on the physician's clinical expertise, observation of reflexes with a rubber neurological hammer, response to painful stimuli, and careful analysis of any spontaneous movement. Dr. E. Leitner noted that Karl exhibited diminished reflexes during the first 24 hours, but astonishingly, he showed no obvious signs of severe brain injury when he finally awoke on the morning of the third day. Dr. Kübler-Ross paused her reading to make notes in her brown leather notebook, the same one that had accompanied her since her years at the Zurich Cantonal Hospital in the 50s. The child had survived a period of cerebral anoxia that, according to the medical knowledge of the time, should have resulted in substantial neurological sequelae. Medical literature indicated that an oxygen deprivation to the brain of more than 4 to 6 minutes generally caused irreversible damage. Karl had been submerged at least twice that long. How could one explain not only his survival, but also the fact that he awoke with no apparent cognitive deficits? It wasn't until early September, nearly 6 weeks after the accident, that the phenomenon that would prompt Dr. Leitner to write to Dr. Kübler-Ross manifested unequivocally. One autumn afternoon, Karl's mother reported a strange incident to Dr. Leitner. The family had been invited to dinner at the home of acquaintances who owned an antique gramophone and a small collection of vinyl records. Among them was a recording of Ludwig van Beethoven's String Quartet No. 16 in F major, Opus 135. When the music started, Karl abruptly stood up, approached the gramophone, and stood completely still in front of it, tears streaming down his face. When his mother asked him what was wrong, the boy replied that he knew that music, that he had played it many times, and that the sound of the violin reminded him of his house in Vienna, a room with high windows and red velvet curtains where he used to practice. The Edlinger family had no connection to Vienna, had never visited the Austrian capital, and certainly owned no musical instruments at home. The parents were textile workers, and the family budget barely covered basic necessities. Classical music was not part of the cultural universe of this working-class family from Salzburg. The day after the incident with the Beethoven recording, Karl began drawing violins with an astonishing understanding of the instrument's structure. The drawing showed proportionally correct representations of violins from different angles. How could a 7-year-old child, with no previous exposure to music or art, produce technical drawings of such precision? Dr. Leitner, a conservative physician trained at the University of Vienna in the 40s, decided to undertake a more systematic investigation. During the consultation, Karl answered the doctor's questions with a disturbing calmness for his age. When questioned about the memories he had mentioned, the boy described a past life in Vienna in the final decades of the 19th century. He said that in that life, his name was Anton Friedrich Weiss, and he worked as a professional violinist, performing in chamber music halls and occasionally at the Vienna Court Opera. Dr. Kübler-Ross, reading these notes in her hotel room in Zurich, immediately recognized the pattern she had found in other cases of spontaneous memories after a near-death experience. As a scientist trained in the European medical tradition, she knew that the most parsimonious explanation for such phenomena involved known neurological and psychological processes. Cerebral anoxia could have caused alterations in temporal lobe function, a region of the brain associated with memory. Electrostimulation studies of the temporal lobe conducted by neurosurgeon Wilder Penfield in the 50s had shown that patients could experience vivid memories when certain brain areas were activated. But this explanation didn't cover the entirety of the phenomenon. False memories, triggered by cerebral dysfunction, were generally fragmented, confused, and lacked the narrative coherence that characterized Karl's account. Dr. Leitner contacted a colleague in Vienna and asked him to conduct a preliminary search in the archives of the Society of Friends of Music in Vienna, Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde in Wien, and in the city's death registers. While awaiting a response, the pediatrician decided to investigate another aspect of the case. If Karl truly possessed memories of a professional violinist's life, it would be reasonable to expect him to have a practical knowledge of the instrument. Dr. Leitner knew a retired music professor, Herr Gustav Brenner, who lived in Salzburg and owned a small collection of historical instruments. The meeting was set for the afternoon of September 22, 1973, at Herr Brenner's home. The professor prepared his music room to receive the boy. He placed 3 violins on a table covered with green felt. The first was a modern student violin, mass-produced in the 60s. The second was a German instrument from the mid-19th century with a reddish varnish. The third was a special piece in Brenner's collection, a Viennese violin built in 1896 by the luthier Franz Geisenhoff, a professional quality instrument with a spruce top and a maple back, whose transparent amber varnish revealed the beauty of the wood. Karl arrived accompanied by his mother and Dr. Leitner. Herr Brenner noticed that the boy stared at the violins on the table with an unusual intensity, not the typical distracted curiosity of a child facing new objects, but an almost instinctive recognition. Brenner invited Karl to approach the table and asked if he wanted to hold one of the violins. The boy hesitated for only a moment before reaching out his hand, but not toward the modern violin or the 19th century German instrument. His fingers went directly to the 1896 Geisenhoff violin. He took the instrument with both hands, holding it by the sides of the body and avoiding touching the varnish with his sweaty palms, a care that Herr Brenner immediately noted was unusual for a child with no prior training. Karl raised the violin to the level of his face, examined the F-holes, turned the instrument to observe the maple back, then brought his nose to the sound box and inhaled the smell of aged wood, rosin, and old varnish. He murmured something that Dr. Leitner recorded in his notes. The boy had whispered that the smell reminded him of cold mornings in his apartment in Vienna, when he would rub rosin on the bow and prepare the instrument before going to rehearsals. Herr Brenner, an experienced musician and teacher who had taught hundreds of students over 4 decades, felt a shiver run down his spine. The professor took the bow that belonged to the Geisenhof violin, checked the tension of the horsehair, applied a sticky resin to the bow with precise movements, and offered it to Karl. He gave no instructions on how to hold the instrument or the bow, wanting to observe what the boy would do instinctively. Karl accepted the bow and adjusted the grip of his fingers on the wood with surprising naturalness. It was a technically correct grip, one that takes months to teach beginners. Next, Karl positioned the violin under his chin, adjusted the chin rest to his left jaw, resting the instrument on his collarbone, finding the natural balance between the left arm and the shoulder. Once again, Herr Brenner recognized a correct posture, developed through long practice. The boy raised the bow, brought it near the strings, paused, as if recalling something distant, then began to play. The first notes were hesitant. The bow scraped the strings slightly. Karl adjusted the pressure of the bow and the position of his left-hand fingers on the violin's fingerboard. He began to play a simple, recognizable melody, an old Austrian folk tune that Herr Brenner immediately identified as a traditional Tyrolean Ländler. The execution was imperfect, but the melodic structure was there. The notes followed in the correct order. After the Ländler, Karl attempted something more ambitious. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play the first measures of a violin and piano sonata by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, specifically the sonata in E minor, K. 304. Herr Brenner slowly sat down in his worn leather armchair, unable to take his eyes off the boy. Margareta Edlinger began to weep softly, her hands over her mouth. Dr. Leitner remained motionless, his pen suspended above his notebook, witnessing something his medical training had not prepared him to understand. Herr Brenner told Dr. Leitner that what he had just experienced was impossible by all the laws of musical learning. A 7-year-old child, with no prior instruction, not only held the violin correctly and produced recognizable sounds, but also demonstrated an intuitive knowledge of posture, bow handling, and fingering that normally required years of systematic training. The Tyrolean Ländler that Karl had played was not a widely known folk tune in 70s Austria, but an old popular song that had fallen into disuse. And Mozart's E minor sonata was a relatively obscure piece in the violin repertoire. Meanwhile, the historical inquiry commissioned by Dr. Leitner to his colleague in Vienna began to bear fruit. The Viennese colleague, a doctor named Dr. Friedrich Hartmann, interested in genealogy and local history, had spent 2 days in the archives of the Society of Friends of Music in Vienna and the municipal death registers. He had found documentary evidence of the existence of Anton Friedrich Weiss. According to the records discovered by Dr. Hartmann, Anton Friedrich Weiss was born on April 23, 1856, in Vienna, the son of a musical instrument maker and a seamstress. He had studied the violin with private teachers during his youth and developed a career as a professional musician, playing in theater orchestras and chamber music ensembles. His name appeared on concert programs preserved in the archives of the Society of Friends of Music, notably at performances at the Musikverein between the years 1878 and 1899. One of the programs listed his professional address as 42 Taberstrasse in Vienna's 2nd District. Anton Friedrich Weiss's death certificate indicated that he died of lobar pneumonia on March 15, 1901, at the age of 44. The death certificate had been signed by a doctor named Dr. Leopold Krauss, and the body had been buried in the Vienna Central Cemetery 3 days after the death. Dr. Hartmann's letter was accompanied by a photographic copy of a concert program from November 18, 1893, on which Anton Friedrich Weiss's name was printed among the musicians scheduled to perform works by Mozart, Beethoven, and Schubert at the Bösendorfer Saal. Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, reading these documents in her hotel room in Zurich on the night of October 3, 1974, felt that blend of intellectual excitement and existential unease that always accompanied her when encountering phenomena that defied the established categories of medical science. The documented historical existence of Anton Friedrich Weiss did not prove that Karl Edlinger was the reincarnation of this Viennese violinist. She had studied depth psychology during her psychiatry residency in Switzerland and was familiar with the concepts of the collective unconscious proposed by Carl Gustav Jung. It was possible, in principle, that Carl had unconsciously constructed an elaborate fantasy. But this explanation faced obvious difficulties. The Edlinger family lived in modest conditions, with no access to vast libraries, no collections of classical music records. Margaret and Joseph confirmed that they owned nothing related to classical music and rarely traveled beyond Salzburg. So where would Karl have acquired the knowledge of an obscure Tyrolean Ländler, Mozart's E minor sonata, and the correct technique for holding the violin and bow? There was the most disconcerting element. Karl not only claimed to remember a life as Anton Friedrich Weiss, but also demonstrated practical skills, a knowledge rooted in the body, a muscle memory that allowed his fingers to find the correct positions on the violin's fingerboard. This type of somatic knowledge could not be acquired passively through mere cultural exposure. It required repeated practice, thousands of hours of training that etched the movements into the deep memory of the body. The doctor drafted a letter of response that same night, typing it on the old portable Hermes typewriter that accompanied her on her travels. In the letter, she thanked Dr. Leitner for the trust placed in her by sharing this extraordinary case and suggested avenues for follow-up study. She recommended that Karl undergo a detailed neurological examination and suggested that Dr. Leitner maintain regular contact with Herr Brenner to document Karl's musical progress. Over the following months, regular correspondence developed between Zurich and then Chicago, when the doctor returned to the United States and Salzburg. Dr. Leitner sent monthly updates on Karl's progress. The reports confirmed a pattern that Dr. Kübler-Ross found highly significant. Karl progressed extraordinarily quickly musically, but not uniformly. In certain technical areas, especially posture, basic bow handling, and simple score reading, he showed an ease that would normally require years of training. However, in other more advanced areas, Karl struggled like any beginner. Vibrato techniques, rapid position changes on the violin, the execution of virtuoso passages, all these caused him the typical difficulties of a learner. In February 1974, at Dr. Kübler-Ross's suggestion, Dr. Leitner conducted a series of structured interviews with the boy, recording the answers on magnetic tape using a portable Grundig tape recorder. Karl described the Taberstrasse apartment with vivid detail. He spoke of a main room with high windows overlooking the busy street, dark red velvet curtains he kept closed during morning rehearsals, a small cast-iron stove in the corner, and wooden shelves where he stored sheet music. The boy named specific names, fellow musicians with whom Anton would have played regularly. He spoke of a cellist named Hermann Storch, a pianist named Josef Reinhardt, and a second violinist named Friedrich Bauer. Karl described specific concerts, including a performance at the Bösendorfer Saal in November 1893. Dr. Hartmann had found a reference to a Friedrich Bauer listed as a second violinist in some concert programs of the era. Even more remarkably, there had indeed been a series of chamber music concerts at the Bösendorfer Saal in November 1893. Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, analyzing this information in her office at the University of Chicago, felt confronted with that border zone where medical science met phenomena that defied simple categorization. She had dedicated much of her career to the study of near-death experiences. But Karl Edlinger presented a unique variant of this pattern. His experience during the minutes of clinical death in Lake Fuschel had apparently not involved the classic elements of a tunnel of light or encounters with beings of light. Instead, he had woken up with complete memories of a past life. The doctor considered several hypotheses. The first was that Karl had undergone neuronal reorganization during the cerebral anoxia phase. The second hypothesis involved the concept of collective memory or the transmission of information by means still misunderstood by science. The third hypothesis was that consciousness could survive the death of the physical body and be reborn in a new organism, carrying with it mnemonic traces of previous existences. This last possibility resonated with the ancient texts the doctor had studied. The Tibetan Bardo Thodol described the intermediate states between death and rebirth. Vedic texts spoke of samsara, the cycle of death and rebirth. The Jewish Kabbalah contained concepts of Gilgul Neshamot, the transmigration of souls. The traditions of ancient Egypt describe the soul's journey through the Duat. These spiritual cosmologies shared a similar conceptual structure. In her seminars on terminally ill patients at the University of Chicago, she often quoted a phrase that had become central to her work. "Death is simply the act of leaving the physical body, like a butterfly leaving its cocoon," she would say. "It's a transition to a higher state of consciousness where there is no more pain, no more fear, only a continuity of the fundamental essence of being in another form of existence." The trip to Vienna was organized for the spring of 1975. Herr Brenner offered to accompany the Edlinger family. They traveled by train from Salzburg to Vienna on a clear April morning. When the train pulled into Vienna's main station, the boy was visibly moved, saying he recognized the building even though he had never visited it in this life. Dr. Hartmann met them at the station. He had planned an itinerary to systematically verify Karl's claims, starting with Vienna's second district, Leopoldstadt, where Tauberstrasse was located. When they arrived at Tauberstrasse, Karl stopped in front of building number 42, a 4-story apartment building with a pale yellow facade. The boy stood on the opposite sidewalk, looking up at the second-floor windows, and tears silently streamed down his face. He said he recognized the proportions of the windows, the design of the entrance portal, the yellowish color of the facade. They climbed the wooden stairs worn by a century of use, Karl touching the wrought iron railing as if recognizing the cold texture of the metal. The landlord opened the door to an apartment that had retained its original floor plan. Karl entered and stood motionless in the hallway, looking around with an expression of painful recognition. He pointed to the spot where, according to his memories, the cast-iron stove was located, described how the red velvet curtains blocked the morning light, and mentioned a damp stain in the ceiling corner that bothered him during the wet winters. The landlord noted that there were indeed signs of old water damage in exactly that ceiling corner. After the visit to Tauberstrasse, the group went to the center of Vienna, reaching Karlsplatz, where the Musikverein building stood. Karl immediately recognized the neoclassical facade, describing performances Anton would have given there. The last stop of the day was the Vienna Central Cemetery. Dr. Hartmann had consulted the burial records and located the grave of Anton Friedrich Weiss. Standing before the simple headstone, Karl let out a sob and fell to his knees in the grass. Karl cried without restraint, not with the sadness of a frightened child, but with the profound grief of someone confronted with their own mortality. Dr. Hartmann photographed the scene with a Leica camera. These photographs, accompanied by detailed reports on the visit to Vienna, were sent to Dr. Kübler-Ross in Chicago. In her private notes, she wrote that the Karl Edlinger case represented one of the best documented examples she had found of a possible past life memory emerging after a near-death experience. The doctor reflected on another phrase she often shared in her lectures. "The reality is that you will grieve forever," she would say, You won't get over losing a loved one. You will learn to live with it. Grief was not something that could be cured or eliminated, but a permanent alteration of the person who continues to live. Over the following years, Dr. Kübler-Ross maintained sporadic contact with Dr. Leitner. Karl continued studying the violin with Herr Brenner and made rapid progress in the first few years, but eventually reached a competency plateau that matched that of diligent but not exceptional students. Brenner noted that Karl's memories of the previous life gradually faded over time, becoming less vivid and more fragmented. Karl Edlinger grew up to become a competent musician, playing the violin in a regional orchestra in Salzburg and giving private lessons. The memories of Anton Friedrich Weiss never completely disappeared, but remained as a deep layer of his psyche, accessible at certain moments when he played certain pieces from the 19th century Viennese repertoire. Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross never formally published the Karl Edlinger case in her academic work. She mentioned it occasionally in private seminars, but hesitated to make it public due to the sensitivity of the case. The doctor continued her pioneering work on death and dying, traveling tirelessly throughout Europe and North America. She visited Majdanek in Poland, examining the remnants of the Nazi concentration camps. She founded hospices in several European cities. Her final years were spent in Scottsdale, Arizona, where she retired after a series of strokes that limited her mobility, but not her sharp mind. The Karl Edlinger case remained in her mind as one of the most convincing examples she had found that consciousness could be vaster, more enduring, and more mysterious than conventional material science was willing to admit. Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross passed away on August 24, 2004, in Scottsdale, at the age of 78, leaving behind an immense legacy of groundbreaking work that completely transformed how Western medicine treated terminally ill patients and the experience of death. Karl Edlinger, already an adult when the doctor passed away, sent flowers to her funeral and a letter expressing his gratitude. He wrote that, even though the memories of Anton Friedrich Weiss had faded with time, they had left him with a deep certainty that death was not an absolute end, but a transition, a transformation, a continuity of consciousness. The story of the boy who remembered being a Viennese violinist remains one of the most remarkable cases at the borders between neuroscience, psychology, and the still unexplored mysteries of human consciousness. It invites us to maintain an open mind in the face of phenomena that defy our established categories, balancing healthy scientific skepticism with a willingness to honestly investigate experiences that do not easily fit into conventional paradigms. If this journey through the mysteries of human consciousness has touched something within you, if the questions raised by Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross about the nature of death, memory, and the continuity of experience resonate with your own reflections, you are invited to join a growing community of people seeking a deep understanding of life's fundamental enigmas. Subscribe to this channel to follow other documented stories that explore the boundaries between science and mystery. Leave a comment sharing which city you are watching this content from. Imagine the beauty of discovering that this inquiry is reaching curious minds in Berlin, São Paulo, Tokyo, Buenos Aires, Lisbon, Montreal, all connected by a common desire to understand more deeply what it means to be human. Every comment adds a bright spot on a global map of consciences awakened to these fundamental questions. And if you know someone else interested in these frontiers of knowledge, share this video. By doing so, you're not just sending information, but launching an invitation to participate in a network of mutual transformation through rigorous scientific knowledge applied to the greatest mysteries of human existence. Together, we build a chain of understanding that transcends geographies, cultures, and individual beliefs, united by the honest search for answers to the questions humanity has been asking since it developed the capacity to reflect on its own mortality. Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross taught us that death is just a transition, like a butterfly leaving its cocoon, a transition to a higher state of consciousness. May we honor her legacy by keeping alive the courageous questions she asked, investigating the mysteries to which she dedicated her life with rigor and compassion, and building together a global community of open minds committed to the search for truth wherever it may lead us. Until the next meeting on this extraordinary journey through the unexplored territories of human consciousness.